Ms. Biggert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Geithner, it seems to me that an ex post assessment proposal that you've been talking about to pay for the failure of a firm that the government deems too interconnected to fail could create perverse incentives. The firm that fails and their creditors don't have to pay the cost of cleanup, but the survivors, those other firms who had no control over the firm's risk-taking, do. So as a result, no individual firm and none of the creditors has an incentive to minimize the firm's risk-taking because the gains are internalized and yet the losses are borne by others. More than that, knowing that the firms that act prudently will end up at a competitive disadvantage to those firms that are taking the risks, and B, having to pay for the failure of those firms undermines the incentives to manage risks.
If the proposal did that, I would agree with you. Yeah. But that's not what it's designed to do. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We want to make it very clear and credible that, again, if a firm managed itself to the point where it's at the edge of the abyss, can't survive without the government, then equity holders and creditors would be exposed to losses in that context. And that would happen before the taxpayer was exposed to any loss. And if the taxpayer was exposed to any loss, then you have to recoup that loss with a fee on the industry. And I think again, that's the model we have today for small banks and thrifts. And it makes sense because other banks will benefit from the actions taken to protect them from the risk that the panic spreads to them. So I think it's fair in that sense.
Well, what happens though is that the taxpayer is the interim lender, aren't they? You know, as that is wound down.
This is taking a model Congress designed for small banks and thrifts and just adapting it to a system that's outgrown that framework. But that system exists today, and I think it's the best way to do it. The alternative way, which is again to create an ex-ante insurance fund that would create an expectation of explicit insurance, I think would create more moral hazard.
Yeah. Well, wouldn't bankruptcy be faster? I think that this proposal, you've got, what, 60, I forget what it is, 60 months or something to settle this while bankruptcy?
Bankruptcy just, you know, again, I think Lehman makes this clear and compelling, and it's why Congress designed a bankruptcy-like system, but it's a different kind of system. We call it resolution authority for banks and thrifts because banks are different. And if they lose the capacity to fund, then they can cause enormous damage to the system as a whole. So you need a slightly different regime for banks because banks are different from regular companies.
Okay. If just let's say an institution the size of Citi or a Bank of America failed, how many institutions, though, would have to be assessed to cover the cost of that resolution?
Well, again,
I guess
the proposal we've made is that banks above a certain size would have to pay a fee because they would benefit indirectly from the actions taken to contain the risk of panic. So I think it's fair.
They benefit because there's one less competitor? Is that what you're saying?
No. Because in the absence of action to manage the failure in a way that's safer for the system does convey some broader benefits. So it's not like, and so again, they should bear some. Now the choice is, which we don't think we like, is to have the taxpayer. Well, again, the way financial panics work is that viable institutions face the risk they lose their funding and therefore have to collapse. That's the financial panics that defined the second half of the 19th century, the first quarter of this century, helped produce the Great Depression, led this Congress, this government to act in the Great Depression to set up some protections for that. What we didn't do is extend those protections to institutions that are very much like banks. Again, the alternative approach, which we would not support, is to say the taxpayer would be there in the front of the line, absorbing the cost of that failure. That we think is not necessary and would be a mistake.
Oh, all right. Then do you think that the government control and concentration of power and the increased unchecked powers to control both the consumers and businesses as outlined in your plans is the answer? I mean, isn't this really a huge amount of power that's going to the administration?
Again, let's just step back. Right now, the Congress of the United States has given more than 4 federal agencies and a whole number of other agencies the power to do consumer protection. They just did not do it well, and we're proposing to consolidate their responsibility in one place so that it can be done better. Now, outside of consumer
so-
investor protection, what we're proposing to do is to make sure the government has the same tools to manage risk it now has in small banks and thrifts for institutions that now define our modern financial system and can bring the economy to the edge of collapse. That's a necessary function for governments to do because banks can pose enormous risk. If you don't constrain the risk-taking of banks, we'll be consigned to repeat the crisis we just went through.
I yield back.